All right, let's jump right in. We're talking about one of the most wild moments in modern history. What happened right after World War II ended? Everyone was celebrating, but underneath all that hope, something else was brewing. The alliance that had just saved the world, yeah, it was starting to crack. And that set the stage for a totally new kind of conflict. So let's dig into how it all went down. So, picture this. The war is finally over. The single deadliest conflict in human history is done. Celebrations are breaking out everywhere, right? But once the cheering stops, there's this huge, looming question. What now? After all that destruction, what do you build on top of the rubble? And, well, the answer was way, way more complicated than anyone could have guessed. Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the attempt to create a new world order, and then look at the push for justice and how that also planted seeds for new conflicts. We'll watch as that Iron Curtain comes down, kicking off the Cold War. Then we'll see how America fought that war, what Truman was doing back home with his fair deal, and finally, how the world ended up split right down the middle. All right, first up, a new world order. This is where our story really kicks off, with the big three victors, the US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. I mean, they had just teamed up to defeat a common enemy, but their ideas for the future? Totally different. We're about to see how that grand alliance started to fall apart. Fast. First thing you've got to understand is America's unique spot after the war. Think about it. Europe and Asia were literally in ruins, but the US mainland, pretty much untouched, except for Pearl Harbor, of course. The war had actually kicked its economy into overdrive, making it by far the most powerful country on the planet, both economically and militarily. That gave the US a ton of say in what happened next. And this slide right here, it shows you just how quickly things went south. At the Yalta Conference in February '45, you've still got FDR, and the mood is pretty cooperative. The big three are planning for post-war Europe, agreeing to divide Germany, and, this is key, allow free elections. But then, just 5 months later at Potsdam, whoa, everything's changed. FDR is gone, Harry Truman is president, and Stalin, he hasn't exactly kept his promises about those free elections in Eastern Europe. The vibe is super tense. Plus, Truman now has a secret ace up his sleeve, the atomic bomb. You can literally feel the alliance cracking right there. So, with the old world basically gone, the Allies had a huge job ahead of them. How do you build new global institutions from scratch? Ones that could actually deliver justice and keep the peace. But as we're about to see, even that effort created brand new problems. So the world basically made two huge moves to try and create some kind of order. First, you get the United Nations, born in San Francisco. This was supposed to be the League of Nations 2.0, an organization that could actually work, using diplomacy to stop wars before they start. And second, you have the Nuremberg trials. This was a massive deal. For the first time ever, Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity. It set this incredible precedent that leaders could be held responsible for their actions during a war. But even these brand new institutions couldn't just wave a magic wand and create peace. One of the UN's very first big jobs was to approve the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And while this was a monumental step in providing a homeland for Jewish people after the horrors of the Holocaust, it was fiercely opposed by the Arab population already living there. It immediately sparked a war and started a conflict that, as we all know, is still a major issue today. Okay, so this distrust we've been talking about, it wasn't just happening in tense meetings anymore. It was about to explode out into the open, splitting the world in two. With no common enemy holding them together, the former allies were now squaring off as enemies in a whole new kind of fight. And you know what's so amazing about this? It's the power of a single phrase. In 1946, Winston Churchill stood up and gave the world the perfect metaphor for what was happening. He said, an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, separating the Soviet-controlled East from the democratic West. And just like that, that single image perfectly captured the new divided reality. And the name for this new struggle? The Cold War. It's called cold for a very specific reason. This wasn't a hot war with American and Soviet soldiers shooting directly at each other. No, this was a battle of ideas. Capitalism versus communism, fought with threats, propaganda, spying, and by backing opposite sides in other countries' wars. So how did the Soviets control their side of that Iron Curtain? Well, Stalin completely went back on his promise of free elections. Instead, he forced communist governments into power all across Eastern Europe. We're talking Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you name it. These places became known as satellite states. They looked independent on a map, but in reality, they were totally controlled by Moscow.
So, faced with this Iron Curtain and Soviet expansion, the US had to figure out a whole new game plan. It couldn't just go back to its old ways of isolationism like it did after World War I. The world had changed. So the big question was, how do you fight a Cold War?
And the answer came down to one powerful word: containment. This idea became the absolute bedrock of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. The goal wasn't necessarily to roll back communism where it already was, but to contain it, to keep it from spreading. You could almost think of it like trying to contain a disease.
The political arm of containment was called the Truman Doctrine. President Truman basically drew a line in the sand. He announced that the United States would help any free nation trying to resist a communist takeover. The first test case? Greece and Turkey, where communist insurgencies were gaining ground. Congress gave him the money, and just like that, the policy was in action. But containment wasn't just about guns and soldiers. The other, maybe even more important side of it was economic. The Marshall Plan. The thinking was pretty simple. Communism thrives in chaos and poverty. So to stop it, you build up strong, healthy economies. And that's what the US did, pouring an unbelievable amount of money, $13 billion back then, which is well over $150 billion in today's money, into rebuilding Western Europe. The idea was to create stable, prosperous democracies that would stand with the US against the Soviets. And the first real showdown of the Cold War happened right in the heart of Germany, in the divided city of Berlin. When the Western Allies tried to unify their parts of Germany, Stalin got furious, and he responded by cutting off all land and water access to West Berlin, basically trying to starve the city into surrender. But Truman refused to back down. Instead, he launched the Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, day and night, American and British planes flew in everything the city needed: food, fuel, medicine. It was an incredible achievement and a huge public relations win. By May of 1949, Stalin gave up and lifted the blockade. Containment had passed its first big test. Now, while all this drama is unfolding on the world stage, President Truman is also fighting some major battles right there at home. He was trying to push forward his own domestic agenda, building on what FDR had started with the New Deal. He called his plan the Fair Deal, and it was pretty ambitious. He wanted to raise the minimum wage, expand Social Security, create federal job programs, build more public housing. He even pushed for national health insurance. But he ran into a brick wall with a conservative Congress that blocked most of his big ideas. He got some things through, but it was a real struggle. But here's where Truman got really clever, especially on civil rights. Congress refused to act on things like ending segregation or poll taxes. So Truman said, fine, I'll do it myself. He used the power of the presidency to issue two massive executive orders. One of them ended discrimination in federal hiring, and the other, this was huge, he completely desegregated the entire U.S. military. With all this political fighting, Truman looked like he was in real trouble for the 1948 election. I mean, even his own party was splitting apart. The polls all said he was going to get crushed by his Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey. In fact, one newspaper, the Chicago Daily Tribune, was so sure of it, they went ahead and printed the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." You've probably seen that famous picture of Truman holding it up and smiling. Because they were dead wrong. Truman had gone on this relentless train tour across the country, hammering the do-nothing Congress, and he pulled off one of the biggest political upsets in American history. And so, by the time the 1940s came to a close, the game had changed. That brief, uncertain moment right after the war was over, in its place was a new, much more rigid reality: a world divided. And this slide shows you exactly what that division looked like in military terms. In 1949, the U.S. and its allies in Western Europe formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a huge deal, America's first ever peacetime military alliance. The core idea was that an attack on one member was an attack on all of them. A few years later, in 1955, the Soviet Union created its own version, the Warsaw Pact, with all its Eastern European satellite states. And there you have it. The world was officially split into two massive armed camps, staring each other down. So, from the rubble of World War II, a totally new world emerged. Not the world of lasting peace everyone had hoped for, but one defined by a tense, global standoff. The decisions made in just a few short years, from containment and the Truman Doctrine to the creation of NATO, set the course for the next 4 decades. It would lead to the nuclear arms race, the space race, wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. So the real question to leave you with is, how would this new Cold War and this single idea of containment go on to shape pretty much everything that happened in the rest of the 20th century?